welcome everybody to this week's LSA Thursday Talk and to the Thursday Talk series in general. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think this is our last talk for what is term 2, 2024. So what better way to celebrate that, the end of a term, than with what I would call one of our very own. We claim you, Jordan, but you are, of course, your very own person. Today's talk is coming to us from Dis Collective. Jordan Whitewood-Neal is going to represent this amazing group. James Zatka-Haas will not be with us today, but Jordan will speak on his behalf, I'm sure. Today's talk is called Cripping, Architectural Pedagogy, Valuing Spaces, Experiences and Histories. And I am very excited and also intrigued to learn more about the subject. I'm ashamed to say I hadn't even really come across the term cripping, but of course now I've really looked it up. So thank you for that. And I'm going to introduce you very shortly. Usually I let everybody take a few minutes to kind of get into the room, but I can see that starting to happen. So I may just keep going and go the full introduction and then hand over to you, Jordan. Yes, as said, this week we've got the pleasure of greeting Dis Collective to present the founding ethos and development of that group and the work that they're doing. This is a disability-led research collective which advocates for the value of disabled experience within space and culture, working against the increasing isolation and atomization of disabled people in art and architecture. The talk will look at how we teach, learn, and facilitate crip discourse within architectural education. This was founded by architectural researcher Jordan Whitewood-Neal, who's with us here today, and artist and writer James Zatka-Haas. Jordan and James are currently co-leading a design think tank. In fact, that has just come to a close, but have just successfully co-led a think tank here at the LSA, as well as working on various projects and pieces of writing which address crip time, history, pedagogy, and the spatial condition of the night. So an amazing subject matter, amazing range of experiences, and really looking forward to hearing from you, Jordan. I'm going to hand over to you right now. And just the last thing I will say is, please, everybody, don't forget to put questions in the chat. We will have time at the end of the talk to have a conversation, have a discussion, ask any questions. So please don't forget to do that. So without further ado, over to you, Jordan. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Let me just see if this shares all right before I carry on. How's that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me today. Just background, I was a teaching development fellow at the LSA in 2021, I want to say, alongside 2 others, and that was sort of my first chance to get to work with the school. And as Sam said, I've been teaching the design think tank the last 2 years. So just to get a bit of context about myself and James, so I'm an architectural researcher, designer, educator, working at the intersections of architectural history, design pedagogy, crip theory, and spatial justice. My research is focused on disabled history at the Architectural Association and various concepts of reliability in the production of space through lenses of crip theory, moral philosophy, technology, and time. James Zatka-Haas is a writer and artist who studied culture, curation, and criticism at Central St. Martin's, UAL, and has written extensively for multiple places, including Disability Arts Online. His work probes what is to experience the world from an altered perspective, understanding how that perspective shapes the way we see, feel, and love. As this, we have led a variety of workshops, public program events, research work projects, and a taught design think tank, as I said, at LSA for the last 2 years. We're currently working on a few projects and pieces of writing which address crip time, crip histories, deinstitutionalized pedagogy, and the spatial condition of the night. We are primarily interested in exploring and developing disabled, deaf, and neurodivergent practices of storytelling, learning, and critique, as well as a way to enact our agency in the built environment. We see ourselves mainly as facilitators of knowledge rather than centers, and we want to develop a collective that not only represents these voices, but exposes their power. So although it's just James and I, the collective refers to the multitude of designers, artists, practitioners, collaborators, tutors, BSL interpreters, graphic designers, and lineages of disability, justice, and crip communities, which our work draws from and is inspired by. So just to give a bit of context, in Against Technical Ableism, which is a book by Ashley Shue, they start by distinguishing between various different terminologies. The work of Lawrence Carter Long is referred, in which he traces the etymology of the prefix "this," one meaning of which is to twain. And he says, twain literally means in different directions apart and asunder. Use of the prefix in this way has given us perfectly good words like discern, discuss, dismiss, dissent, and distill. When used in this way, being disabled does not necessarily suggest a lack of anything. For us, this represents taking position of opposition. We are learning to use opposition as a tool for agency, as a way to position ourselves and others, not as the opposite of normality, but to center us in opposition to it. Learning to be in opposition means following the words of Canadian-American poet, writer, educator, and social activist, Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinghe, who says that our bodies are not liabilities, they are weapons. Now, the term cripping or crip refers to, and it's mainly used in academic circles at the moment, is used to refer to experiences and embodiments which fall outside the maybe politically understood framing of disability. These are experiences which are beyond the sort of socially understood norms of what disability could be or what difference could be. It is used as both a describer of someone, a crip. It is used as a verb, to crip. And here we are talking about cripping architectural pedagogy as a way to understand architectural pedagogy through a crip lens, to understand it as something that can be different, that can be embodied differently. So before getting into the work of this specifically, we wanted to briefly share the story of Andrew Walker and to speak to these wider themes of space, history, and disabled experience. It is sometimes hard to define the significance of a moment at the time of its occurrence. The disciplines and practices of history thus take on the role of looking back, agreeing on what is significant or insignificant, and from that point onwards, we say we know which is which. Those deemed insignificant are not remembered, and as such, they are merely forgotten. Andrew Walker was a technical tutor at the Architectural Association. He became a wheelchair user following a fall from a roof that resulted in a spinal injury in the 1980s, receiving treatment and rehabilitation at the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital in London. This was in fact the same hospital I had my spinal rehab at 30 years later, which included a new rehab centre that Walker himself designed. So I've always felt a sort of strange affiliation with him, even beyond the research. He returned to the AA, to his teaching position in 1982. And following his return to the school, Walker's freedom of movement within the AA's Bedford Square was greatly diminished. Its complex levels, small corridors, and almost maze-like organization of rooms were not designed to accommodate a wheelchair or many disabilities for that matter. Walker's significance to the history of architectural education was not merely his return to and presence within an architectural institution ill-suited to support him, but instead what he produced in response. The Environmental Access course was a disability-centered day-release diploma that ran from 1992 to 1999, a one-day-per-week curriculum for a multitude of designers and other professionals, both disabled and non-disabled. The significance of the course was that it was a course of, and not just for, disabled people. It was designed to function across disciplinary and bodily lines, to view access as a collective challenge rather than an act of labour enforced on those that a lack of access most affects. Fundamentally, it was Walker's attempt to destandardise not only the way access was perceived and conceived, but the pedagogy of the Architectural Association itself. I begin with this history to underpin a critical question about the concept of significance. Who decides and how is it decided what constitutes something significant? And how does significance relate to standardization and reliability, and their impact on the necessity of diverse and equitable futures? The work of Andrew Walker and his course at the AA have been relatively underexplored in architectural history, existing for a long time in memories and the archive as seemingly inconsequential course documents, which in fact construct a picture of a course and the tutor struggling with a resistant institution. So on this slide here is a diagram or drawing I produced, which is the ground floor of the Architectural Association. And the green highlighted space is actually the space which Andrew was able to access without assistance in the AA. And this represents a tiny fraction of the school itself, which is this multi-leveled Edwardian building, and represented as sort of significantly less space available to him after his accident. So, thinking of history, in Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, written by Sadiya Hartman, she begins by stating that every historian of the multitude, the dispossessed, the subaltern, and the enslaved is forced to grapple with the power and authority of the archive and the limits it sets on what can be known, whose perspective matters, and who is endowed with the gravity and authority of a historical actor. The archive as a space, which is arguably a strong representation of historical practice, also underpins how we approach architectural pedagogy, something which relies on learning, applying, challenging existing lineages of design and thought. But when these underlying lineages already omit disabled thought to design and history, our resulting pedagogies become forms of epistemological violence. Just a small note that if you wish to read more about Walker, and I hope you do, there is an open access article I published in the Journal of Architectural Education titled Worship the Lift Engineer, and I can provide the link to the school afterwards. But this gives a sort of more extended history of Andrew and his life and work and the course that he set up. So with all this in mind, this theoretical context of thinking about disability and crip history, I think we can begin to kind of construct and understand the roots of this as ethos and challenge. So our work began back in 2022, when James and I just happened to meet on a Zoom call, of course, for a piece of research at the Royal College of Art. After many further meetings and discussions with each other, we began working towards what would later become this. We bonded over a common observation that a collective focusing on disability and disabled thought on architecture and architectural practices was lacking in the UK. But most importantly, that disabled knowledge and experience was undervalued in design and pedagogy. Our first official event was Invisible Tales at the London Festival of Architecture in 2022, in which we brought together 10 disabled designers, artists, architects, and performers to share stories of their experiences in the city, discussing collective and sometimes even conflicting experiences of mobility, safety, policing, and culture. It was in many ways a space for us only to listen, discuss, and to reflect. In 2023, we were chosen as one of 4 people or collectives, alongside Poppy Leveson, Hamza Sheikh, and Edit Collective, to present a manifesto at the Design Museum. We framed our manifesto, which you can see me and James presenting here in front of a room full of people, around subverting some of the qualities that are associated with disability, these being slowness, weathering, incompleteness, reliability, absence, and discomfort, which all represent a series of questions around opposition, such as, what does it mean to be slow in opposition to the pace of the world? What does it mean to be weathered by time, people, or climate? And how do we as disabled people become weatherers ourselves? What does it mean to challenge the need for completeness? What does it mean to be reliable in space, in our bodies, and to rely on things? And how can becoming critically and powerfully reliable function as an act of opposition? What is the potential in absence, and what are its dangers in both history and the present? And finally, what can enable discomfort to be an act rather than something we are subjected to? How can we use discomfort to disrupt the hierarchies and standards of space to find our place within it? And then in 2023, we were lucky to take part in something called Seats at the Table, which was a public realm intervention for the London Festival of Architecture, created by the Disordinary Architecture Project and Refabricate, which collaborated with disabled children, designers and artists to create an installation in Postman Park. So you can see here a bunch of people sitting on furniture, which was co-designed with disabled students and kids. And this furniture was installed in the park and was there for a couple of months during the summer. So this not only took part in some of the initial site investigations for the project, but also contributed to the public programming through the summer. We led an interview with disability and architecture scholar David Gisson, author of The Architecture of Disability, and later in the summer also held a community drawing event, challenging participants to use multiple types of drawing to communicate their experiences of the park and installation. So in this photo, there's maybe 20, 30 of us sitting around using these chairs that were designed by the children. David completely sitting on the right, with me and James either side. And it was sort of a more collaborative interview where not everyone had read the book, not everyone necessarily understood what the book was about, but just for a conversation, we set up, managed to talk around our own experiences of disability and how architecture is constructed in relationship to it. And then in 2023, alongside Carly Dixon, who works at Arup, Christopher Scarr from Universal Design Studio, and Marnie Walker from the University of Sheffield, won a bid to produce a Good Growth by Design report for the Greater London Authority, exploring disability within planning, design, and development. Through this report, we have looked at the role of language in both the discipline and its institutions, in defining or limiting how disability is understood. We've explored the design review process and used case studies to highlight alternative models of procurement, production, and living. And we've been exploring the importance of equitable and varied community engagement practices and the need to create more robust strategies for giving agency to disabled communities. And this is an ongoing piece of work, which should be coming out hopefully later this year. And then just the other week, as part of this, we took part in a Good Growth by Design panel covering the idea of the inclusive city. And you can just about make up my face on the screen in the background there. This was also with Neil Shasaw on the panel. And we were talking around Good Growth by Design projects, talking about how we create an inclusive city and sort of address some really complex questions around why we're not there yet and how do we think of this production of an inclusive city in relationship to the urgency of time. So it was a great conversation. So now we can move on to some of our teaching. So as a bit of context, Shannon Matten, who is a researcher in the US, her work focuses on systems within cities that can support and give agency to its communities. But she also frames maintenance rather than new developments as key to climate and socially sustainable environments. The way we maintain the city can become a way of giving back to local communities at risk. And this is how we are currently defining reparation as a social practice. So from this, our design think tank, Retrofit as Reparation in 22-23, taught by ourselves, Carly Dixon, and with the support of Arup, asked how we can create new understandings of the terms and methodologies of retrofit and reparation in the context of making cultural and civic spaces accessible and inclusive, not just to meet standards, but to an expansive reparative agenda. We view the repair of the city as a reparative act that not only seeks justice and equity, but in doing so aims to abolish the systems practices and institutions that proliferate that for which the reparations are sought. So you can see here in the images, 2 images side by side, of our students visiting our Cola Theatre in Dalston. They were led by May from Arup, who gave sort of like a tour, but also thinking around inclusive design and engagement with the theatre to sort of understand what their limitations are as a building. Because it's often that these cultural spaces either don't have the financial or the skills capacity to actually make the change they need to do for disabled communities. In terms of retrofitting, researcher Jay Dolmage argues that it is an additive rather than a reimaginative ideology. And then for disabled scholars Amy Hamray and Remy Yago, retrofits are post-design deviations from otherwise normate templates that are often based on the body minds of cis white non-disabled men. To quote Yago, it is less common for us to think about retrofitting as disabled folks composing normative space or as a necessary strategy for an inaccessible world. So we really wanted to view through this think tank how we can reimagine the practices of retrofit and reuse to become not just responsive to disability, but so that it actively plays a part in its methodology. So for example, we looked at projects such as Block Party, from independent living to disability communism, which was exhibited at the Center for Architecture Reset exhibition. This was a project that reimagined the architecture and urbanism of a section of Berkeley, California, through the perspectives of disability and housing justice. In this picture, you can see quite a large model, which illustrated various different design interventions in this sort of local suburban area. And then, so basically, this design think tank culminated not only in an ambitious adaptive reuse of our Cola Theatre in Dalston, but also a set of social, institutional, financial, and spatial strategies for both councils, communities, venues, and designers to create more reparative forms of reuse in the future. You know, this was addressing issues of how community infrastructure levies and Section 106 were used to actually fund and support cultural infrastructure to adapt and to become more inclusive and accessible, but also how venues themselves can be leaders in this space. And then we come to this year. So there are many ways to approach the night. It is familiar, it is where we sleep, dance and wander, love and lie awake in bed, search and find refuge. And yet it is also elusive and uncertain. The night can be closed off. Sometimes it is violent and come to be silent, too noisy, too dense. Nick Dunn calls this total picture the nocturnal commons, a commons we are collectively responsible for, and one which is not always responsibly or collectively designed. For this year's design think tank, titled Into the Dark, which was run by Carly Dixon, Dan Jensen, and supported by Hackney Council, we approach the night not as the absence of light or the preeminence of darkness, but as a question around time and how it can form our perceptions of night, how it is claimed by certain groups and subsequently denied for others, how it is prolonged or shortened. We wanted to explore how nighttime can be reclaimed for disabled people, not only for infrastructures, but by reimagining what the night can offer, how we might inhabit it, and how we might find our place within it. One of the references for this think tank was pictured here on the page, which was Crip, which is a Toronto-based collective, which aims to provide inclusive and accessible nighttime culture for crip and disabled communities. So students engaged the underexplored realms of public space at night through the lens of disability and crip theory. By analysing nighttime usage of public space and its inhabitation by disabled communities, they uncovered what infrastructures, support networks, community spaces, public amenities and refuges are diminished by inaccessible spaces at night. What makes a space accessible during the day may not necessarily make it accessible at night, and what makes a space inaccessible by day may be felt more intensely by night. So nighttime spaces are practically non-existent for disabled people, and this contributes to both a sense of vulnerability and that the public realm, should seek to counter this. So this drawing is by someone called Claire Fentress, and it actually spatializes the workday for a hospice worker in Florida. It's an aerial view map showing this person's movements throughout the night. So we're very much considering both disabled people and communities, but also the infrastructures, both spatial and people around them. So through fieldwork in and around Broadway Market, theories of welfare counter collapse, this idea of countering how welfare has collapsed over the last several years, or many, many years, diminishing marginalized community infrastructures, and disability-centered design, students developed their own specific and radical methodology, proposing a form of community urban room that supports nightlife and reimagines the public realm for the reuse of traditionally closed or meanwhile spaces. Using nighttime walks to engage with disabled community members and practitioners to inform design and strategic directions. So these are a couple of pictures from a nighttime walk that was held with disabled community members and practitioners, which was through Broadway Market and around it, also visiting the Hackney bus depot. And this walk was documented through film, imagery, through taking notes, through sort of participants filling out forms about spaces they encountered. And we found it to be an incredible methodology for how to engage with a community in a different sort of temporal scale. So beyond the design think tank and beyond the teaching, we at DIS have also been interrogating the night through crip and disabled experiences through an installation at the Museum für Gestalten in Zurich. This exhibition, which was titled Design for All, with a question mark, will be opening later this year. Our contribution includes an audiovisual narrative created by DIS in collaboration with sound artist Pedagogy, exploring disabled experiences from hospital to streets, as well as a collection of interviews with disabled and neurodivergent design practitioners in the UK, all contemplating nighttime futures. So with all of this work in mind, with all this thinking, with all this teaching, we can start to ask, what role does the idea of destandardization, for example, and the making of unreliable architectural history pedagogy play in the construction of crip and disabled futures? Ignacio Gallen, whose student's work is shown here, wrote a paper called Disabled Practices for Architecture of the Counter-Collapse, and proposes the counter-collapse as a movement in response to the collapse of the welfare state of the 1980s. His students proposing infrastructure that challenges individualism and austerity for community care networks. The collapse of welfare and its continued degradation put into question concepts of reliability, but in turn, possibilities such as that set out by Gallen presents us with practices that frame unreliability as to no longer rely on or be reliable as disabled agents, but instead to construct, use, and gain power from infrastructures beyond the institution. So Gallen says, disability offers a new horizon for architecture. Moreover, it illuminates new forms of practice necessary to achieve it, thinking of ways in which architecture might engage in transforming a world with compounding injustices and inequities. It is necessary to challenge established hierarchies inherent to current and obsolete modes of practice. Operating in a context deemed broken, it is far too easy to imagine the architect doing the repair, following technocratic logics while expanding the legitimacy of architecture. These regimes of abundance, as Gallen calls them, which are necessary to make existence possible, speaks to the possibilities that these standardized and unreliable practices bring when they are bound by collective action. This idea of abundance speaks powerfully and truly to the depth and breadth of the reality that institutions, politics, and powerful individuals consistently attempt to obfuscate. This idea of abundance also provides us with a strong tool for reimagining architectural pedagogy through the lens of disability. And finally, we can listen to the words of philosopher Paul Feyerabend when he states boldly and without question that the world we inhabit is abundant beyond our wildest imagination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Really an fascinating and informative and really rich territory that you are clearly so very much at the center of, and just to kind of understand how your work not only sort of starts to inform discourse or be very much again at the center of that discourse, but also think about how it's going to impact wider professional responses, I think is really, really helpful. So thank you for putting all of that into context. And I think it's such a sort of, I think I'm not the first to say this, it sort of feels so shockingly still new as territory to be working on, yet we know it's been thought about for many for several decades at least, or many decades. And Andrew Walker, is in fact he was my technical tutor.
Oh, really?
I was at the AA, and in fact the photograph you show in 1988, I was thinking, was that me in that room? It could easily have been, because I was studying at that time. But so I remember that room well, and I remember sitting there with him, and he was an incredible person, embracing what was to him a relatively new version of the world.
Yeah.
And I was really privileged later in it would have been 2000, in fact, when Tate Britain opened. Tate Modern opened, and found myself at the top of the ramp with Andrew, and unexpectedly, and turned to him and he went, "Okay, I'm going to just let go." And I said, "You can't do that." And he said, "I can. They've designed it this way." And off he went down this incredible ramp. And I thought, crikey, this is a whole new beginning in the world of design and space. But he was thrilled that was suddenly a part of a landscape that he could access. But that little green space at the back of the AA was that was where he was for many years, which is just kind of extraordinary, really. But the course was powerful. The other thing, and I'm going to go to questions in a minute. The other thing it prompted me to remember was in this book, which I spent a long time putting together, but this is the talks and articles volume of the Cedric Price works. Cedric did a talk for Andrew's course in 1993.
Oh, amazing.
And in that talk, he says, it's a Cedric talk, so I will definitely not try to paraphrase it. But he does say to architects generally in the audience, what should we be working at? And he says, well, I'll tell you what we should be working at. For one, we should be working at the art and science of enabling activities and happenings, be they random or planned, that hitherto could not occur in the built environment. And that was his response to, and then he goes on, I will just read the next sentence. He said those activities could occur over the telephone, in a love letter, in a book. Why is architecture so insensitive? So it was a Cedric mantra that architecture was incredibly slow and built environment is incredibly slow to come to ideas and come to think of ways to respond to all citizens. But does it feel to you now that there is more response, that there is more awareness, more desire, or whatever the word is, I don't know what the word is, to turn a lot of words into action.
I think there definitely is desire. I think that there's pockets of it. Like I'd say it's always working against an equal amount of pockets that are maybe trying to pigeonhole disability fall into what they think it should be in terms of the built environment. And it's not necessarily a case of working directly against that, but it's working in opposition to it in a dialogic way, in dialogue with it. Because I think, there's multiple forms of thinking around space and disability that are valuable, but not any one way, One thing that James and I kind of come up with a lot is that, I come from quite an academic background in terms of thinking, and James comes from an art background, and then some of the stuff we engage with comes from a very kind of, Selwyn Goldsmith, universal design, inclusive design sort of background, where there's an established set of ideas and standards and rules in a way for how things should be done, which is always developing. But they alone cannot address the sort of deeper systemic issues that are ingrained with disability, especially when you think of it, as you must, holistically with race and gender and class, etc., in the city. So I think that's where collaboration needs to happen more. And I think it is starting to. I think this is partly why this kind of started, was not necessarily because there was a complete absence of it, but that we were noticing that there were people that were coming up that were doing great things. Chris Lang with Deaf Architecture Front, who again is very different work to what we do, but equally valuable. And I think there's been quite a strong culture, both academically and publicly, of disability sort of activism and justice in the US, for example. I'd say in the UK, that it's not been as strong at points, especially to do with space directly. In terms of disability justice generally, it has been. So I think we're at a point where that can shift. I'm particularly interested in that happening within architectural education and pedagogy, is because you want a generation of practitioners who are going to understand disability and crip histories in complex ways, so that they can respond to them through design in complex ways as well.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you think that, I mean, for instance, the ARB has spent the last couple of years introducing lots of new criteria for students at both levels, part 1 and part 2, to engage with quite specific areas of or be compliant in quite specific ways around health and fire and life safety, ethics and professionalism, sustainability. I don't see necessarily a kind of particular focus of that. More perhaps it's embedded somewhere in the ethics part, but the design should be thinking much more inclusively and that's where it's, the sort of bottom line is courses are designed with all those criteria, the RIBA and the ARB criteria sort of mapping behind them. And and that enforces quite a lot of attitude towards what must and must be discussed and must be considered. Do you see enough of this work being sort of articulated enough in those kinds of criteria, do you think?
No, not at all, or at least not in the way it needs to be. I obviously we taught design for the think tanks, but I think what I'm better at maybe is maybe architectural history and theory, and I think that has always been part of curriculums, right? It's always sort of run alongside design studios, etc., maybe sometimes as a second priority. But I think disability thinking within that area of education is incredibly limited. You know, we're not taught about space through that lens. And I think that's one space where the current and even future like plans, ideas around how we're taught architecture is not necessarily responding to that enough. I think there's, again, pockets of people doing great things around this, but they are individual studios, or they're one-off courses, or their workshops, but there's not been an integration into sort of the sort of holistic way that we teach and learn. But I think, you know, like if you look at the work of like Matrix, you know, from when was it, the 80s, you know, Just Boys and stuff, like their work was all about how the intersectionality of these issues means that if we do start to think more deeply around disability, for example, you can evolve the discipline to a point where it's addressing a multitude of things.
Yeah.
But you have to be very careful to find that kind of application or universalism without eradicating disability as a focus, if that makes sense. Because that can often happen. And that's what happened in universal design. It kind of disability becomes something under an umbrella. And therefore you kind of lack that kind of nuance of it.
Yeah. But I think that sort of that seems to me the power of certainly the architectural project in the academic setting is that ability to really nuance, really develop a nuance. I mean, that was what was, you know, for those who haven't seen the think tank work, I recommend looking at it, and we will certainly exhibit it at our end of year summer show. But how that work sort of really does begin to nuance and bring together language, which is so central to the subject in many ways, and look at how one can see the built environment through a lens, but really as a part of a whole.
Yeah.
And the importance of projects to do that, and I mean architectural projects, because you can really explore those things, and you really project that world. I guess it's inevitable that I would advocate for that as a method, but certainly to see it in drawings and see it in familiar spaces, but to see familiar spaces of our cities represented in you know, shown to us in very different ways, or shown, you know, those revealed to us in different ways, I just think is incredibly powerful. So I'm really delighted that you do that work. I also remember having spent 3 really fantastic days with you. It was 2 summers ago now, working on that project in Hackney, thinking about how to get from Hackney station to Hackney Town Hall, and just that experience of what it revealed, that piece of the city, what that meant. I will never see it in the same way ever again, or indeed the rest of the city I experience in a completely different way now. So those very live actions and just understanding and reading the space around us is just so powerful.
I think that charrette, that what you're talking about, that walk, kind of, I think must have been in the back of my head when we were constructing this brief, because, you know, we put walking as a practice very central to this brief and as a methodology, and I use walking obviously in the broadest and most holistic of ways, but as a way to kind of experience the space and a route together, and understand it not just spatially but but socially as well. And the work that the students did for this current design think tank was, you know, I think they took away as probably the most valuable thing out of the whole sort of module, for them, which was great, because I think, you know, it was a chance to be with but talk to people and just see the world and Hackney through a completely different lens. which I think is, as a designer, as a thinker, is an incredibly valuable thing to do.
Yeah, it's incredibly instructive. Now look, I have some questions, so I'm from the audience, so I'm going to put those to you, if that's all right.
Yeah.
The first one is that you mentioned establishing this due to limited work being undertaken in the UK. Are there other areas that are perhaps more progressive and proactive in this work, do you think?
As in like other
I suspect the question means
groups.
other possibly or in other disciplines.
Yes. So I mean, I think part of what pushed us to do this was that there were many collectives or groups being established around the same, or sort of before that and around the same time, which were addressing kind of questions of feminist practice, questions of race, various questions of gender and sex, and doing amazing work. But yeah, it was just that kind of lack of disability within sort of that was able to engage with those conversations. They kind of expand, and I think now we're kind of getting to a point where we do have so many amazing collectives that are doing such diverse work, that we're starting to see intersections between them, which I think is really important, because I think we can easily get stuck in our kind of like focus, which is valuable, but I think you can also have blind spots when you're focusing on particular things. So yeah, that was definitely something we noticed, and something that pushed us to create this.
Great, thank you. And how do you see this evolving in the future? Would it be a team of people working full time, or perhaps a continued research and education platform? You've sort of begun to answer that just now, but perhaps
It's a good question. It's one that we've been wrestling with ourselves. Like I said at the start, we've used the term collective on and off, to be quite honest. But I think it's nice as kind of a separate word to describe the fact that none of this work is us just sitting in the room doing it ourselves. It's very much collaborative, and I think that's we want to bring in a variety of disabled voices, because me and James represent one, granted, small portion of the community, and therefore can only directly address certain things. In terms of the future, we've always discussed bringing on people or creating a sort of wider network, but again, I think more as collaborators. And then a question around growing and expanding, it's kind of that question of at what point do you become not institutional, but how do you counter what that kind of expansion sometimes requires? How do you sort of maintain sort of a sense of radicality and sort of responsiveness to what's going on? And I think that's something we're going to have to tackle over the next few years. I mean, the one thing we struggle with a lot is funding, either because we're not necessarily a organization, or we're not necessarily structured in some way, or we don't have a board, etc. Or there's issues like an arts council is traditionally a great form of funding for groups like us, but then you've got to sort of wrestle with ethical issues of working with an organization which is currently not being at all correctly responsive to the issues in Palestine. So sometimes your funding can dwindle quite dramatically. So, which is challenging when you want to do more work. For example, the Invisible Tales event that we held in 2022, we crowdfunded for, so that we could pay participants, so that we can pay the BSL interpreters, and luckily we managed to do that. But it's not something you can do every time. But I think it's great that organizations and institutions like yourselves or schools, can support that work. I think this has really grown thanks to the teaching on the design think tank. I think that's really helped us think through ideas, think through how these ideas materialize, also to bring up the challenges that come with talking about these ideas, and how they can become incredibly complex very quickly when you start to translate them into design. So I think doing stuff like this has really helped us grow, and I think doing more in the future will also help us develop these ideas and situate ourselves more.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, the more you and your thinking and the group's thinking and those who are you work with tangentially embed themselves in projects and project making, I would have thought that's, it's a really holistic way of developing the work.
Yeah.
Seems critical. Good. Well, I look forward to that. Then I have one more question before very likely we close. We're coming to the end of our hour. But can you share how the concept of valuing spaces and experiences for individuals with disabilities has evolved within architectural pedagogy, and what opportunities and challenges lie ahead in this domain?
Yes.
Mm.
Good question. So the first part was more about how valuing individual experiences has come into pedagogy. Yeah. So I guess I can talk about that in a couple of ways. I could even talk about it in terms of my own pedagogy, because this research I did about Andrew Walker was part of my master's in research at University of Brighton. And I only found out about Walker because I put a tweet out about wanting to know more about disability history at the Architectural Association, and the archivist Ed Bottoms responded to me and said, you should check this paper out. And the paper was by an ex-student of Andrew called Evelyn Grace, who wrote what I would still argue is the most comprehensive overview of the course. And that from that point onwards, that was the focus for 2 years of my life, which was understanding Andrew, looking through the archives. And like I said earlier, I felt a real affiliation with him, not just because our disabilities were very, very similar, but just the spatial and social challenges he'd come up with while working. At the same time that I was starting to teach, and teaching during COVID, where it was all online. So his kind of individual history and story became, I think, very important and had a massive implication to how I thought around institutions, how I thought about how we teach, how I thought about the impact that spaces have on our ability to just act, in the world and take part in it. Yeah, so for me, as an individual, valuing his experience, I think allowed me to extrapolate much more thinking, which I now still using, to develop my own work. And then in a different context, for example, with last year's and this year's design think tank, we very much encourage students to directly interview or work with disabled people and to hear their experiences, and then to translate that into design outcomes and proposals. And I think that's where some of the most rich ideas came out of, because you hear things and you begin to value things that you never considered before. Yeah, so I hope that answers that question.
No,
was there a second half of that I missed?
Well, it says I think there's no. I think you answered very beautifully. I think there was a second part which says, what opportunities and challenges lie ahead in this domain, and maybe that's a slightly second part.
Yeah, I think uncovering further histories that can inform pedagogical work and architectural thinking are not easy labor. They require a lot of work. I was working with the archive for a long time with Andrew, with Ed Bottoms, going through a lot of material, some of it useful, some of it not. So actually sort of understanding his histories can be challenging, both in terms of labor, but also emotionally. I referenced Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Saidiya Hartman, which is an incredible book. And that is her sort of using archives to understand the histories of Black girls in the US. Incredibly emotionally challenging work, but it's incredibly valuable to really understanding how, just regular people live, people that aren't made icons within architecture. The traditional people that we're taught about and learn about in architectural history and theory, or the designers that we're told to look at to reference for our project. Yes, fantastic, but this kind of the canon of who we know, the canon of who we know is sort of very limited in many ways. So I hope that we can begin to expand that, but I think it needs to be a collective effort somehow.
Yeah, I think that's a really great place to end in a way. I mean, from where I see it, I think, we are certainly talking about our architects in a very different way now. I mean, we were delighted to welcome Daniel Liebskin to the studio yesterday, and that, is sort of that idea of the architect 80s, 90s version of how we revered our architects is a very different, to welcome him into the studio in an entirely different context and different time, and him doing work which is also very different. The kinds of clients, I mean, he's working for are very different to many that he's more known for, and the conversations that brought out couldn't be further from that sort of version of how we thought about architecture 20, 30 years ago. Which is really interesting to see. But that entirely is born out of more collaboration and more across discipline and across agendas, really, this idea of different architects having very different agendas, which they should, of course, but they're only actually very interesting when they're brought together, and have to kind of work against and up against each other. So I think it's a really, I'm delighted we can work in a place where all of those conversations can happen and are respected equally, I have to say, and we must continue to do more. And as I said, hopefully see more of that thinking go into project making.
Yeah,
because it needs to be there for sure. Thank you so much, Jordan. I think everybody's lunchtime has come to an end. So back to the afternoon. I really look forward to more think tanks working with you and this collective, and learning more about how things do evolve ahead. And I look forward to seeing everybody in the audience back here next term 3, I think sometime in April. You will definitely be notified and I think we are actually going to have some of our talks not online but in person in the studio, which is also an exciting proposal. So I hope, Jordan, you will be able to join us too. That would be really nice. Great. Thanks so much. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us, and see you very soon. Have a good Easter. Bye.
Later.